Occupational therapy is about connecting people with things that matter, that they care about. It's about looking at the narrative of a person, who they were before they're in the situation that they're currently in, who they are now, and who they want to be, and connecting all of those. And with veterans, that's incredibly important because you can take someone out of the military, but you can never take the military out of someone.
As I was preparing for today's episode, the word seclusion kept coming up. And even though seclusion doesn't necessarily or might not necessarily fit in occupational therapy, but it kind of does. Because what happens is that when people lose hope or lose a connection, they just kind of back away. And seclusion is the scientific word for backing away, right? Or just stepping back that way, because what happens is, like, if we need something done, let's say this needs to be done, but I have these steps, and it's like, but I can't complete this now without doing some steps from here. And there's some steps I might not be able to complete without doing this. So all these things, all these dots need to be connected. That compounds, the issue. And when communication is learned or ingrained in us to be direct and sometimes forceful, we come across as jerks, and we can hurt people's feelings. And not really wanting to go there, sometimes it's like, it's just the preferred route. It's like, just get away, right? But typically, it's like, not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. It's just like, these things I need to get done. And, some motivation behind it, there's some extra juice, extra sauce, and people might not understand or appreciate. And so that can cause many, many types of different problems. And so even though the road to hopelessness, there are many paths, that is, definitely seclusion, whatever gets, seclusion, that gets us, real disappointed real quick, and disenfranchised. And so what I enjoyed about this episode and learning with Twylla is that she, not only herself, in her profession, but in her profession, she's teaching people, young minds, how to connect with veterans. And so there's hope right there. And allowing them to work with veterans that might be on the latter part of their life, it doesn't matter. It's just, whatever walk of life that, part of the walk of life they are, it's like we come across certain situations. And what's great about occupational therapy and working with people like Twylla and the people that she's teaching is that they take someone's wants, desires, loves, and encourages their body to work in that direction. For instance, fishing. Say you enjoy fishing, but your rotator cuff, or you don't have the balance to sit in a boat. There are ways that they can work on fixing those problems, those physical, those attributes, right, or lack thereof, physical. And they can, the regimens that are prescribed, working out to diet to, what I shouldn't say diet, but working out helps people gain their mental health back, because when you're able to do something that you enjoy, you're healthy, right? You get excited to go and do things, and you get excited to share, which is before, that with the sharing and trying to get something done not being met, that leaves a person, as I said, disenfranchised. But when you start seeing results in a positive manner, then people, it's like, then we start connecting. And that's what I really enjoyed about listening to, Twylla, in this episode, in this interview, and I hope you do too. What got you into thinking about veterans' health, physical and mental?
Well, it got me into thinking about veterans and their quality of life really is, or was. I was an enlisted soldier. I was actually here at Rocky Mountain College, ran out of money, had to join the military was offering to pay back your student loans, and I needed that at the time, and so I went into the military. And I was enlisted for quite a while, and then I went through ROTC and got my commission then, and was a medical service corps officer, and started in San Antonio, and then went to Korea, and then Fort Drum, New York, where I got married, and I had my first child, who was premature. And I love the military, but when you have kids, we were dual military, somebody has to put the kids first. So I decided to get out and go to occupational therapy school. And I got in at UNC Chapel Hill. And it was a weird transition, leaving the military I'd been in for 10 years. And so when people were late, it would drive me crazy. And I really had to figure out who I was outside of the military, because it really was who I was for so long. And so having said that, when I finished my OT master's degree at Chapel Hill, my husband was still active duty, so we traveled all over the country. And I did school-based because that was an easy fit. And then partway through that, I got really tired of that and kind of a little burnout. So I decided to go back to get my PhD. And at that time, I transitioned to geriatrics. And it was a pretty steep learning curve. But some of my first jobs were working with veterans in skilled nursing and home health, and I really wanted to give back to that community and sort of help bridge the gap between healthcare and understanding military culture for civilians, so that veterans could get the true benefit of the healthcare that they deserve. So a lot of my research and my research for my PhD at Texas Women's University was understanding how veterans adapt to long-term care. It's a rough transition. So I looked a lot at military culture. I looked at what they considered home, what they valued, and through that work, during that time of getting my PhD, I was the director of a veterans home in North Carolina, and the only evaluating OT, so I was pretty busy. And so that research really led me to want to understand how to make the quality of life for older veterans who were placed in long-term care better, how to bring quality. I remember the first day that I walked into that facility, and the entire staff had quit, except we had some PRN people. So I was the only therapist that was permanent there at that time. And one of the veterans came in. He was a World War II veteran, and he looked at me and he said, I don't want to do therapy. He said, my family doesn't really want to take care of me. They put me here, and I'm just waiting. I'm biding my time until I can go across the street. And I was like, across the street? I looked out the window, and there was a cemetery there. And he's like, yeah, I'm done. Like, I'm done. Like, the sooner I can get over there, the better. And so that was heartbreaking. And so, occupational therapy is about connecting people with things that matter, that they care about. It's about looking at the narrative of a person, who they were before they're in the situation that they're currently in, who they are now, and who they want to be, and connecting all of those. And with veterans, that's incredibly important, because you can take someone out of the military, but you can never take the military out of someone. So, and it was interesting, because most of the patients were male, because that's how it was, and still is. There's not many females in the military compared to males even now, but back then it was much less. So, but as soon as they found out that I had also been in the military, like, this rapport built. But I kept thinking, like, what can I do to get them back to living, so they want to live, so they're excited. So, and even if it's one day before they pass on, and many of them did, because they were World War II veterans. And so, but one day of a good life is better than not having that at all. And so I remember one particular veteran who came in. He had leukemia, and he had left his home after 50 years, and his wife had recently passed away. And he was pretty sick, and he too did not want to do therapy. And so I said, well, what can we do? What matters to you? What would make you happy? And he said, growing gladiolus. He said, I used to grow them for my wife. My wife passed away. And he said, you've looked outside of my window, and there's that gazebo full of broken furniture. There's all those weeds in the gardens. And he said, it's depressing. He said, I want to look out my window and I want to see gladiolus. So I really didn't have a clue what that was. So I went to the Walmart, and I found some gladiolia bulbs. And the next day when he came in for therapy, I sat them down and I said, I don't know what these are, but maybe you can help me figure it out. And he said, I think I can do that. So he ripped open the bag and he started showing me which end you plant first, how far apart they have to go. All of his therapy goals were embedded in that. We went out that same day and we weeded one of the gardens, which worked on strengthening and sequencing, and he stood because we were working on standing endurance and balance. And so all of those things were embedded in that. And the next thing I knew is we had 4 garden beds full of gladiolus of all different colors, and he was excited about therapy, and he would cut those and put them in the front of the building, and that was his daily thing, and that's what he gave back, right? And residents who were confined to their room for whatever reason, he would take flowers to them. Well, as soon as other people started seeing what he was doing, some of the other patients and residents, they wanted to start growing vegetables. And this was a part of North Carolina that was very poor. About 40% of the people that lived in that community were below the poverty level. And many of the people that worked in the facility and maintenance and housekeeping, they literally did not have enough food to feed their family. And so the residents, the patients, they started growing all kinds of tomatoes and herbs and cucumbers and onions and gladiolus. Now, there was a bit of a war between the flower people and the vegetable people, but we figured it out. But I remember coming into work one day, and a couple of the residents were furious. They were fuming, and I said, well, what's wrong with you? And they said, well, we saw Joey out there. Joey, he works in housekeeping, and he was stealing our tomatoes. And I was like, oh man. And they're like, we couldn't get out there because you weren't here, and we just didn't know what to do about it. We banged on the windows with our cane, but he didn't stop. And then we had a conversation about Joey and about the community, and we talked about the fact that Joey had 3 kids, and the residents started to kind of put it together that Joey probably didn't have enough food for his family. And they were like, wow, we hadn't even thought about that. And so they said, you know what we can do? We can put some baskets together, and we can put them in the staff lounge. And then the people that work here, they don't have food, they can take it home to their families. And then they said, you know what? We're going to teach Joey how to grow a garden. And so they went out and they clipped plants, they put seeds together, and they gave them to Joey and actually 30 other people that wanted to grow gardens that worked there, and they grew those gardens. They'd bring pictures in on their phones and talk to the residents. And every human being has an innate need to give back and to be a contributing member of society. And so a lot of times when we put not just veterans, but anyone in long-term care, they lose that ability to be able to give back and to be human in a lot of ways. And so that's what it did. So this 1-star facility became, by the time I left, this was a 3-year sort of project that we did, and it continued after I left as well, probably not at the same scale, but it transformed this place into a family, and it gave the veterans there an ability to connect and give back to their community and to the people that lived there, and a compassion in the way that people were treating one another. It changed, and it made a complete difference in that facility, and people were seeking it out to put their loved ones there because of the garden project. It gave a space that staff could go if they needed a break, because it wasn't like therapeutic. It was a beautiful, about the size of a half of a football field area where people could go and just be. We played jazz music, we picked vegetables, we cooked for family members, and they brought recipes in. Families started bringing in shrubs and other things from the loved ones of veterans home so that they could see them growing there. And it was really, really magical. But it is one of the most important things I think I've ever done. I knew that at that point, because I was getting my PhD, that I would be the director of an occupational therapy program. And it was really important to me that I would be able to stand in front of students and say, you know, I went to a one-star facility. I went to a place that no one wanted to be. And we together transformed it into a place that was full of life and love and happiness and family. And that's really powerful. And so I did that. And so you can do it too, because I can tell you my story of how it happened, and I still do that. So I share that with students. In addition to that, when I left there, I went to James Madison University.
Actually, sorry,
Yeah.
Because I know we talked about that, but something I want to compound on is that it's like an innate thing, but it's also not really. I mean, it's like there's some training. So getting into the point where you see a need, and like the gentleman with the gladiolas, how much is that? Can you describe the connection? Because this is like, because it's like, it's a connecting to. Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Yes, so the gentleman who was growing the gladiolus, it was a connection to his wife, right? It was a connection to his previous life. It was something that he was passionate about, and that he felt really good about his ability to do, and to be able to teach me and other people in the facility, the other therapists and people that work there, how to grow these beautiful flowers and to share them with us. It connected him with his past. It allowed him something that he could do in his present, and it was powerful. It was something that he connected with. It brought him back to life. I mean,
how did you connect the dots? How did you connect to him through? I mean,
Okay, so occupational therapy is a very client-centered discipline, and so what we try to do with occupational therapy is really understand the person and meet them where they're at. And so one of the things that I try to do as an OT, and I try to teach my students to do, is to ask someone what matters to you, and so asking that gentleman what would make you feel better, what would help you connect to this place, so that it doesn't just seem like this place you were put. How do we make it feel like home to you? And then he said, I need to look out my window and see some gladiolus, and that's what OT does. We meet the people where they're at, and we validate them and we listen to them, and that's what we were able to do with him.
Okay, cool, thank you. So James Madison.
Yes, so from the Veterans Home, I went to James Madison University, and I was a program director there for 4 years. During that time, a lot of my research was veteran-based, so looking at family members who were caring for veterans who had diagnoses of post-traumatic stress, and how that affected the family, and how to really help the family members take care of themselves in a way that they could be there for their loved one, the veteran. That was one of the studies that we did. The most recent one that I did before I came here to Rocky Mountain College was with a student who was a Gold Star sister. Her brother had been killed at age 22 in Afghanistan, and she had a huge network of veterans who loved him and loved her and were willing to tell their story. And their story was about healthcare and what their experience was like in the military with military-based healthcare, and what it's like now with civilian healthcare. And they, our students there at James Madison, were able to ask the veterans, what advice do they have for future healthcare providers? What do they want to see in the providers that work with them? And the responses were beautiful. We have a manuscript that we're currently hoping to publish with that information, but that was a powerful study. And so when I came back home, I'm from Montana, 5th generation, but I'd been been away. As a service member, I left here for Rocky when I ran out of money over 30 years ago, and went into the military, enlisted, and then became an officer, and then was a military spouse until about a year ago. And so being able to come back here to Rocky Mountain College and start the first occupational therapy doctorate program in the state has been a tremendous honor. And it's interesting because while I was in the military, I appreciated it, but I knew there'd be other things in my life. What I didn't know is that everything that I learned about management and leadership and taking care of people and inspiring people was what I learned in the military, and that I certainly wouldn't be or have the capacity to do what I've been able to do here without that time. And so I'm really grateful for that. One of the reasons I wanted to come back to Billings, Montana and start an OT program here is that occupational therapists work with mental health, and we have one of the highest suicide rates per capita here in Montana. And that's devastating. But the second fewest number of occupational therapists in the country are here in Montana, second only to Wyoming. So we have this need, and we have no occupational therapists doing any mental health work. So I wanted to really capitalize on that and start a program to get students inspired and make a difference. So our program is very community-based, and we have students working with veterans in the community here now. And my research has continued to focus on veterans. And so right now I'm looking at starting a new project where I'm looking at military families and really looking at how that moves and the military culture impact kids and what that looks like. So it's kind of a preliminary study, but I know from my own life that it can have, in some ways, the moves and the just being unsettled a lot of times, and the stress of deployments and all of that has a negative effect on kids. And if we understand that better, maybe we can do more to be preventative and help them have better lives. So that's the current study that I haven't started yet, but we're underway. But yeah, so we look forward to not only doing research in this area, but doing community-based work and lift those up around us in this community, especially our veterans.
What's the difference between connecting with a civilian and connecting to a veteran?
I think one word comes to mind, and it's respect. So I think it's really important, based on the research that I've done, both with older vets and younger ones, is that you don't get in their face, you don't tell them what to do. There's a respect there, and a distance until you're invited into their life, and not to make assumptions. It was really interesting. One of the veterans who was in Afghanistan and actually was in the same vehicle as the student's brother who was killed, he said he doesn't like to be thanked for his service. He said that he just was doing his job, and that really bothers him. So I think the assumption that we make, and that's a courtesy, right? Or you give up your seat, or you do these things. It's not global, and it doesn't work for everyone. So just because someone has a uniform on, the things that they value and want and need from a healthcare provider could be very different from what you would assume. And so not making assumptions is really important, and giving the person time to tell their story and listening without giving tons of advice is really important.
Bring up an interesting point. One of the complaints that a lot of people just throw out there or say, one of the complaints is that when they go to a healthcare provider, there's just not enough time put toward them. So the way that the current status is like there's not, because you want to connect to your patient, but you got to have that time to create that inroads. Can you talk about that dichotomy, please?
Yeah, so occupational therapy is a little different in that we often do have more time to spend with patients depending on our setting than, say, a medical doctor would have, or a psychiatrist. I think the one cool thing about occupational therapy is we look at the mind, body, spirit connection. And our belief is that unless you address all of the needs in all of those realms, you're missing something. And if you think about it, if you think about depression, when you're depressed, you don't feel like being physically active. It affects your whole being. So you can't have one of those aspects of a person not being in the right place and expect the person to be functional. So I think occupational therapy is a beautiful profession in the way that in most cases we're allowed time to really get to know our patients and our clients in ways that other healthcare providers aren't. And we also, that holistic aspect of care that we provide, I think is a beautiful fit. I will say that not everyone is a fit to work with veterans. One of the things you have to understand about the military is a lot of it's geared on combat. So if you're not someone who is comfortable with that is the occupation, especially if you're working, say, in a warrior transition unit with veterans, and you're making the determination whether they go back to the military service or they transition to the civilian sector, you have to understand that throwing the pin on a grenade or assembling and disassembling a weapon is what they might need to do, might want to do, and might need to do to be able to go back to service. And so if you are anti-war, clearly that's not going to be that you shouldn't be working with that population, because you might actually have to learn how to disassemble and assemble a weapon so that you can help do the activity analysis to help the person be able to do it, maybe with a prosthesis. You don't know. I think the civilians that work with military have to really do some soul searching and make sure that they're able to really truly meet either the service member or the veteran where they're at with no judgment. Because that's the first thing they're going to feel. And I think be okay with asking questions and not making assumptions such as, thank you for your service, because I was really surprised to find how offensive that for that person, it was a trigger for him. He didn't want to hear that. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess this would be a good point, because we're kind of there. Well, okay. 2 questions. The VA. Kind of compare and contrast. And then occupational therapy, it's not really a therapy that is supported. It's like an insurance thing. It's like you can only go so much. Is that a fair?
It depends.
Like I said, my knowledge and understanding is quite minimal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So occupational therapy is similar in delivery and reimbursement as physical therapy and speech therapy. Other than in the military, active duty military, you have to have a physician's referral. So civilian sector, we have to have a physician refer someone to us. And there are some caps, yeah, I think it's pretty accessible. I don't think, again, it's most closely associated with physical therapy. And physical therapy, the difference being that their main focus really is through a medical model, i.e. the person wants to walk or the person has a prosthesis and they need to know how to don and doff it. Whereas again, I see OT, occupational therapy, being different in that we're really looking at the holistic person. We work with behavioral health, so that's a strong aspect. We work with physical medicine. So and do there's a large focus. So active duty military tend to work stateside when we're not in a war with orthopedics. So there's robotics, prosthesis. We also work with cognition. So soldiers who've had traumatic brain injury. That's a focus for us as well. And then we work with geriatrics. We also work in pediatrics. So there's a large span of what OTs do that physical therapists might not do. But yeah, I think the access is pretty good for veterans and service members to be able to get OT. OTs are on all military installations, but again, in non-combat, it's mostly ortho. They're working on those kind of things, usually, yeah. But in combat, we, interestingly, occupational therapists are assigned with the combat stress unit, so they go right into mental health. And the occupational therapy was founded in World War I. They called us restoration aides, and they were right behind the front lines, and soldiers who had combat stress, which is what we now call PTSD, would be referred to the OT team, and they would engage in things such as crafts and making things to help the person get back to functioning. And usually once they were sent back into the combat zone. And interestingly, we still do some of that. So some of the things that OTs might do in a war zone would be looking at stress management techniques, doing things, engaging soldiers in things that would normalize and help them feel balanced and get back to living. So there are things like game rooms with ping pong tables in the middle of Iraq, and bringing some leisure type activities back to the person so that they can sort of get back to living again. Making pancakes, things that we take for granted, but it matters, right? It matters. And so there's still some ortho work that's done, but very minimally the focus is dealing with mental health. And so that's what OTs do, very close to behind the front lines in combat zones as well. So it's an interesting transition. So to go from ortho to mental health, but that's how the military is set up. I know that there's some work right now being done at the Pentagon to look more at preventative care. So looking at healthy diet and exercise to help soldiers, service members be more resilient, so that if they are in combat and experience a roadside bomb, that they are better equipped to deal with the repercussions of that and have a better chance of resilience and getting back to being functional after it happens. And I'm really hoping that I think the work is moving forward, where these teams of let's help the person before they get in the situation, build competence and resilience, and so that once, if God forbid that happens, they can recover in a better way than we've seen in the past.
How would you describe the teamwork or the scenario at the VA, or some? I mean, it's not like, it's like case by case, but how would you describe the VA and the civilian civilians working together with, and how would you describe, how the VA is handling taking care of vets?
Well, I remember the VA taking care of vets. So it was about 10 years ago, I think, where all those news stories broke where things weren't going well in the VA, and I think some change came about because of that. I think there's a disconnect. I have never worked for the VA. I've been in VAs, and I've heard stories, and a lot of the research was geared toward what the service members felt their treatment was, and it was sort of a mixed bag. The research, some of the veterans had great stories and felt supported and valued, and many did not. The lack of time and compassion, I think, are the two number one things that emerged in that particular research study, that service members felt that they weren't validated and valued when they were being seen at the VA. They weren't having the same healthcare providers, so they were having to just tell their story over and over, and there wasn't continuity of care. And so they were dissatisfied with that. I mean, I'm not an expert in VA care. I can only take the voices of those that we've interviewed for some of our research and sort of share their perspective. I think there's a lot more that can be done. And, our veterans definitely deserve that. So that continuity of care. I would love any civilian that was going to work with veterans to go through sort of a program on understanding military culture, so that they have a better understanding of how best to connect with a veteran and what might work and what might not. And I think that's something that would be a really valuable tool. Even in the warrior transition units, though, we're looking at civilians that go in and they really don't have an understanding. And what I found is, if your approach in the first about 30 seconds of working with a veteran in any kind of healthcare, if you step in it, then you're done. You can't go back and fix it. So I think just understanding how to make that connection initially is so important. And again, as I mentioned before, I think not making an assumption that because this person was a veteran, that this is how they are. Everybody's a human being, and while we all have the military part, we're all very, very different, and what we want and need are different as well. So time and compassion, those would be my two recommendations. And some kind of a training on like, what does this mean? What is this military culture? What did this person, or what do people, or what do families go through, and how can we better support them, would be really important.
When they're downrange and the symptoms start to, or the things just starting to kind of start going awry, and then they come back to the rear, can you kind of talk about the process of, the formation of PTSD and PTSD, how things are operated, how things are handled back, once they're back in, active, but my God, man, I was, the gentleman we were talking to yesterday, he was National Guard, and so it's like, now you're going back out, you're coming from, hot zone, and now all of a sudden you're in civilian, and so you can't be any more, I don't know about dysfunctional, but it's like, disconnected more, because unless you go to a drill, and then you kind of have that semblance of what you had before, but still, when I was in the reserves, I hated it, because it wasn't, you can't replicate active duty.
There's a disconnect between reservists and active duty, and I think a lot of it is resources. So I was in the National Guard here, actually, in Billings, and I remember, we didn't have the best equipment, we didn't have the best things that are at hand. And so, when you take reservists and you embed them into active duty units downrange, you're gonna have a disconnect. They haven't trained together, and active duty and reservists side by side. It's a leap. There's a disconnect, and this is probably an area I can't speak as well to, because I have never been an occupational therapist in combat, so I don't.
No worries. And I asked it poorly, because you were talking about when they come back to the rear, how they're kind of, the Section 8.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can kind of just talk about how, you know, you know,
Oh, yeah, okay.
moving it, you know, how a person is like, okay, you're Section 8, and then like, you know, how they're, so if you could kind of talk about that for me, please.
Yeah, so there is a culture within the military that everyone needs to be able-bodied and able-minded, and so basically, the military is about going into combat or supporting combat. So you don't want to show any weaknesses, and there is a culture, and I hope it's getting better, but I'm not sure that it is, about not being comfortable sharing. When you have something going on mental health wise, because it's seen as a weakness. So I know for a fact that service members hesitate to share that, because there's there's a medical evaluation board. So if someone is either physically or mentally not fit for service, they go through an evaluation board, a medical evaluation board, MEB, and they can be separated from the military with something called, I think it's still called a Section 8, where it's a mental health issue, and they'll be separated. And with that, they can get an honorable or a general discharge, depending on what the circumstances are. But this is the livelihood for many of these individuals. Their families depend on it, and it's very humiliating, and there are repercussions that can follow that person. So there are so many reasons why someone would hesitate to be very open about having a mental health condition in the military, because of the stigma that's associated with it, and what it might actually end their livelihood. And so there are many, it kind of depends on the commander of that unit, but yeah, so it's difficult. It's really difficult, and you can understand why. People hesitate, or service members hesitate to share their story and to seek out help. I don't know about the current standards, but when I was an enlisted behavioral health specialist and I did intake interviews, mental health intake interviews, I was required to share all of that information that I was told in the intake interviews with the commander. So if the person said anything about hurting themselves or hurting someone else, they would go before a medical evaluation board and maybe be separated. And so I can't imagine that that's changed that much. I hope that it has, but I would imagine that that protocol probably still closely followed. I'm not sure of that.
No, that gives me insight, because, I mean, we have other vets that we're going to be interviewing. So that I forgot all about that. I mean, it's been so many years it's been, so I forgot all about that. So I appreciate the reminder. Okay, so you're talking about back to when Montana is like one of the highest rates with the lowest amount of OTs. I mean, there are like so many different ways of combating the suicide rate, but it really sounds like a key component to fighting that is OT. Is that I mean, not trying to make toot your own horn or anything like that, but I mean it's a very important thing.
It could be.
Okay. Is there I don't remember all the states and where they rank, but is there a correlation between OT professionals and suicide rates?
Is there a correlation between occupational therapy and lowering suicide rates? I don't know. I don't know if there's research that shows that, but I would love, basically I feel like my job in this community, in this state, this region really, is to set the ground, work for students. We have 30 students that come in every year, to go out into the community and show the distinct value of what occupational therapy does, and to grow jobs. We've already grown 2 jobs in our community. One in Rimrock Foundation, which is an addictions facility. Our students going in there and kind of showing what OT would do. And they're willing to consider hiring an occupational therapy now, occupational therapist, and they have veterans as well that go through there. And it's one of the only but most well-known addictions facility in our state. And so our students are already doing that. And so while I view the faculty and myself as sort of facilitating that, our students are the ones who really do the work. Imagine when we have 90 students. Not all of them will want to work with veterans, but a big portion of them will. For years to come, long even after I'm here, the work that the students will do will be of benefit to veterans in this community and state, and I'm really honored by that. I mentioned that occupational therapy looks at the holistic person, mind, body, and spirit, and what and the spiritual side absolutely means church and God and Jesus and all those things for some people, but it means other things to other people. And what I really love about occupational therapy is that we embrace all of that. So I have a good friend, and for her, her connection and feeding her spirit is hiking. So she has to go up and be in the mountains, and that feeds her spirit. And for her, that works. And so there's no right or wrong way, or and again, that's person driven, and it looks different for everyone. And meeting people where they're at, and just because for me, it's God. It works for me, and I definitely wouldn't be here without that belief. But everyone has a different belief that works for them, and filling your spirit can be in the kitchen cooking the best food and having your family over and having great conversation. That can be feeding your spirit. So I think that openness to that piece, that spirituality piece, is vast. And we have a variety of religions and cultural beliefs, especially here in Montana. We have Native American beliefs, and I think those are fabulous. And I think that open acceptance that there isn't one way, there are many ways, and that's driven by the individual. So
beautiful, awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it was really cool. It was like the gentleman I was speaking to on Saturday. Like I said, he's an alcoholic but not active, and the thing that got him out of that was his he just went back to his culture. So he was like dancing. He was, when I showed up, he was threading up beads, around an eagle feather.
Wow.
It was purple, so because he's a Purple Heart.
Yeah.
For his card, and it's just so he's finally in a healthy place, because now he can say he's a Vietnam vet, but it took him forever to he just ignored it.
Yeah, I know.
And so now he's he's in a very healthy place, and it was just a beautiful thing.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and that's kind of what I'm talking about with occupational therapy, is that, that look at all those things that he does now that matter to him. The music and the singing and, getting back in touch with who he is culturally. That is who he is. And once he was in a place where he was able to do that, it's kind of like a circle where that brings peace and quality of life and health and well-being. And that is occupational therapy, that connection with what really matters and the roles of who you really are, and trying to connect those in healthy ways.
And so, the juxtaposition of drugs and addictions, granted, drugs are, there is a need, as we've seen. But, when it gets to be in the way, like the addictions and stuff like that. So can you talk about the unhealthy side, of drugs and getting into the addiction?
Yeah, so addictions are, if I look back at my time in the military, there was always drinking. There was always alcohol involved. And it is, I believe, part of the military culture, even now. And so I think, drugs are something that if you're hurting and you're lost and you don't know what to do about it, it's an escape and it numbs the pain. And 9 times out of 10, when I talk to people who use drugs or drink too much. So I think moderation is key. I think in occupational therapy, what we say is if whatever you're doing is affecting your function, either your ability to have good, strong social relationships or your ability to get to work on time, if it's affecting your function, then it's a problem. And so, but I think it coincides a lot with active service members, maybe not drug use because you get drug tested, but over drinking, and then once you're lost when you separate. Like you don't know who you are and how you fit anymore. You have to redefine yourself, and if you're already dealing with a lot, you've had buddies that didn't make it, and you don't know why you made it and they didn't make it, and you got to deal with that sort of guilt that you can't shake. You're going to look to almost anything to numb that so you can get through your day. And then once you start doing it, and some of them are prescribed. I mean, if you've had an injury and you've been prescribed Oxycontin, and you can get, as we now know, addicted to that very easily and very quickly, and it becomes a crutch to help you get from day to day. It becomes this pattern of dysfunction that just unravels, and I think individuals just don't know how to break that cycle of like, how do I get through the next day without this? And it can be really tragic if they don't find their way out of that.
Okay, so when you're doing your flowers, the garden, the food, and stuff like that, how much anger did you see, and then how did that change over time?
I have a really good story about one veteran in particular, and he was young for the facility that we were in. I mean, he came in his late 50s. He was a Vietnam vet, and he had been diagnosed with MS, and he didn't want to be a burden to his family. He wasn't married, and so he admitted himself to this facility, which, when you compare a younger Vietnam vet to a World War II veteran, there's quite a 30 span years in between there. And there was a lot that I wanted to do for him as an OT. I wanted him to, because he was losing his ability to walk, and so I wanted to get him a motorized scooter, and there was just all the stuff I wanted for him, and he just absolutely refused. He said, I came here not to be a burden for my family, and I just want to die, so leave me alone. And so we have to respect the patient's right to either want therapy or not, and he was very adamant that he didn't, which I found very heartbreaking. And so I was thinking, what can I do, right? So one of the research studies that my major dissertation for my PhD was about understanding military culture and building the connectivity between a facility and how do we make it like home, more like home, but we had to understand what the veterans needed. So I was able to pull him in. One of the components of that was food. The veterans were not loving the food there, and so food is such a universal connection. And if you've been in the military and you've traveled to Korea and you've had bulgogi and you've had kimchi and you've been to Germany and you've had the beer there, and I mean those kind of things stay with you, and you always still want to eat them, and they're part of your story, right? And you want to share them with other people. And so what we did, we had about 12 veterans, and I included this gentleman, and I was surprised that he was willing to help me because he didn't want to be on therapy at all. So, but this was separate. It was this study that we were doing, and this component, and there was a spiritual piece as well. But as they were able to pick any food they wanted, anything, and even if they wanted it cooked a certain way, to give us the recipe. And we had things like catfish fry, which we did out in our garden area. That was really good, really interesting. But this particular gentleman who didn't want therapy, he wanted barbecued pig's feet. And his grandmother had cooked them for him when he was young. And he had been craving them for a very long time, and I had no earthly idea how to cook. I mean, I've never eaten pig's feet. So I found one of my physical therapy assistants knew how to cook them. So she cooked a whole thing in this crock pot and brought them in, and I have to admit, I did not try them, but the veterans all sat around this beautifully decorated table, like beautiful, in the gazebo with their music that they picked playing, and the food that we cooked there, or the pig's feet we had to have cooked and brought in. And they told their stories about each of the dishes, and they shared them, and they passed them around. And I remember that gentleman, I thought I was going to get fired, because pig's feet are very salty, by the way, but he ate literally three plates of pig's feet, and he was in heaven. And for that day, for that moment, he was happy. And that was powerful. It was really powerful to hear those stories about what each of those dishes meant to them, and what, like his story about his grandmother and how he grew up. And then they're always connecting their stories of the military. It was a really special day. And so I think that's the part about kind of typical things that we take for granted in our life. When you take them away from someone, or they can't access them, and then you give them back, what a gift that is to be able to give,
Yeah. Okay, so while you're talking about that, you brought up, or kicked off the memory of the guy who hadn't spoken in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And all he did was just touch the ground, and all of a sudden words come out. So if you can.
Yeah, we had another patient who was on therapy caseload, and we thought we were going to have to discharge him because he was in a reclining wheelchair and he wouldn't talk. He wouldn't acknowledge us. There was no real response, and we didn't really know what to do with him. And we found out that he really hadn't been verbal with anyone in a couple of years. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So it was a beautiful, warm summer day in North Carolina, and so I took him out to the garden, and we had just cleared out one of the beds, and they were wheelchair height, which was really cool. And I just wheeled him up next to it and was thinking, what am I going to do here? And so he takes his right hand and he sticks it down into the dirt, and he starts moving his fingers, and he turns to me and said, "You need to aerate this soil." And I nearly fell over because he hadn't said anything in 2 years, and I was like, what? And at that time, they hadn't taught me much about gardening, so I was like, what's aerate? You have to make holes in it so that the vegetables can breathe. And I was like, oh, well, I don't really know how to do that. Here's a shovel. Do you think you could help me? And he sat right up, and he started poking soil, and then he said, well, what are we going to plant? And, that's getting somebody back to living. And so, that's what life's really about.
That was John's story. Thank you for watching. Greatly appreciate it. Make sure to subscribe, like, and share. That'll help us out. And because Saving 22 podcast, it's creating community. That we are, we as veterans, we're already a community, but it's just trying to be that, bulletin board. It's like, hey, this is what's going on. This is what's out there for us. And if you need it, give them a call. Give someone a call. And or as you listen to some of these people's testimonies, it's like, yeah, that's what I went through. And or maybe it'll encourage you for the day, or something that keeps you going. And so that's what Saving 22 podcast is all about. It's like bringing a community together, and helping each other keep moving forward. Thank you for watching today. I hope you got something out of it. I hope it inspired you to go out and find your way of helping a veteran, or just helping yourself, because it's all about mental health. And that's what this podcast is about. Even though I bring attention to 22, being 22 veterans a day taking their lives, it all, at some point stems to mental health. And whatever, causes, gets into mental health, whether it's physical, financial, or spiritual, they all work and are intertwined with each other. And so keep working, keep at it, keep choosing to live. That's a beautiful thing. And keep helping, someone else be encouraged. So, and while you're liking to help someone, sharing the message to help someone, and subscribing in the ideas, do the same thing for this video.